Welcome everyone to another AML Gray Matters broadcast. Today is 13th September 2023. Where has the year gone? It's almost finished. My name is Kimberly Smith and I'll be your host. I'm a former compliance officer for those of you that don't know me. And then that is, of course, if there is such a thing as a former compliance officer. I don't think we ever really retired, do we? Today, we welcome back Elizabeth Lees of Claritas Legal in the Cayman Islands. Welcome, Elizabeth. Welcome back, I should say.
Hi, thanks so much. Thank you for having me.
Yes, and before we begin, a little housekeeping. This webinar is not legal advice. Elizabeth is a lawyer in the Cayman Islands, but everybody should get their own legal counsel. The webinar should last approximately 1 hour, and you are encouraged to post questions, and I'll do my best to present those to Elizabeth at the end. Certificates of attendance will be auto-generated for attendees of the live broadcast only, and you will receive that email in approximately 1 hour after the broadcast. You will also be sent the recording in a few days, and you'll get the instructions on how to get copies of today's slides, because we cannot send those with the recording because it's the slides are usually too big to use as an attachment. So, but I will be giving you some instructions on how to get copies of the slides. Additionally, I have arranged a survey to go out after today's webinar, and I would be extremely grateful if you can take a few minutes after the webinar to respond to that survey when it hits your inbox. It's going to help me identify your challenges and topics you want us to cover in the future broadcast. I'm also trying to get a feel for the AML community's appetite for AI technologies. Finally, I am going to be hosting an open demo of the Silo compliance system tomorrow. So if you're curious about what Silo can do, please join us and you'll get more information about that as well. And so with no further delay, let's go ahead and get you started. This is a big topic. We only have an hour. Elizabeth has a lot to cover to kind of get everybody up to speed with, even if you're not in Cayman. I know we do talk a little bit about the Cayman regulations, but even if you're not in Cayman, it's great because this is probably going to impact a lot of countries. So even if your country's not quite there yet where Cayman is, or if you're ahead of the game, she's got some great tips for all of us. So Elizabeth, I'm going to let you go ahead and just present. I'll try very hard not to interrupt unless I have a burning question on a particular slide. And remember, audience, please post your questions too, and I'll keep an eye on those. So Elizabeth, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Kimberly. I wanted to start by going back to the basics, and I know there was a great AML Gray Matters webinar. I think it was the last one you did on proliferation, which was really interesting. Just to recap, so proliferation is the manufacture, acquisition, possession, or basically all these other types of interaction with nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, their means of delivery, and related materials. This includes dual-use technologies and dual-use goods used for non-legitimate purposes. So as people probably know, dual-use goods are goods that have a legitimate non-military purpose as well as a military purpose. It includes technology, goods, software, services, and expertise. And then just to recap on WMD, this refers to nuclear, chemical, radiological, or biological weapons, all weapons that can inflict mass casualties and destruction. So if we can just bring that home into what that actually means in real life, we can see on the next slide, I have put an image from RUSI, which has a lot of useful information on proliferation financing. They did a year in imagery, which was released early 23, recapping over 2022. North Korea held a number of massive military parades intended to signal its defiance of international sanctions. And RUSI states that over the course of the year, a range of new systems were tested, including the world's largest road mobile ICBM, a missile designed to strike targets on the US mainland with nuclear weapons. So sometimes I know it all sounds very hypothetical, And I think it's important to just remind ourselves what we're talking about in terms of proliferation. And we'll also see when it comes to proliferation financing, how this may still be relevant, even if there are no cases within your jurisdiction. So what then is proliferation financing? It's been hard to reach an international consensus on this definition. FATF has stated that it refers to the act of providing funds or financial services which are used in whole or in part for the manufacture and all those other items we just discussed relating to the use of nuclear, chemical or biological weapons and their means of delivery and related materials in contravention of national laws or, where applicable, international obligations. So the literature notes that access to the financial system and financial services is central to proliferation efforts, and disrupting this financing is key to countering the spread of weapons of mass destruction. So what we're really talking about is how do we stop the misuse of the financial system to aid and abet and be used by proliferators and proliferation financing in order to fund these weapons of mass destruction. So we also note here that the stages of proliferation financing differ from what we see for money laundering. So money laundering, we all learned, placement, layering, integration, although there's some debate. In fact, it's a bit more complex, but that's what we learned old school. So for proliferation financing, we have raise these funds, obscure them so that we don't know or can't see where they've come from or where they're going to, and then procure and ship. And that is taken from CIMA's guidance notes. And what I would just like to note about CIMA's guidance notes here is that CIMA issued revamped guidance notes this year. The proliferation financing section, which is section 14, was actually already in place. So that's an older proliferation financing guidance. It still has a lot of useful information, but it may well be that when we see the regulations come into force that we'll talk about, which will require these proliferation financing risk assessments, that indeed the CIMA guidance on this is updated and more specific as it relates to that. So I just wanted to point that out. But the guidance notes.
I just wanted to interrupt one. For those who aren't familiar with CIMA, that is the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority. So that's what we're referring to. They just issued those new guidance notes.
Yes, thanks, Kimberly. So that's our main regulator regulating financial institutions and also trust and corporate service providers. And they have just reissued 2023 guidance notes. So in relation to those guidance notes, there's a helpful comparison between money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. And I think this is important because we often see entities saying they've done their risk assessment and they've taken into account all these risk factors and sort of a one size fits all. And it's really important when you're considering a proliferation financing risk assessment to make sure that you're taking into account those factors that are relevant to proliferation financing specifically. And we'll come on to those a bit more in a moment. But first of all, if we can just look at a few of the points in that chart, in CIMA's chart. So for money laundering, it's circular. So the money's going out, it's being moved around. And then, of course, the money launderer wants to profit from it and get the proceeds back. Whereas in proliferation financing, it's linear. The money is used to purchase those goods and parts or the technology and then shipped. And the money is also used for insurance. So it's not coming back to the person or entity who is responsible for the movement of the funds. Transaction amounts is another interesting one. For money laundering, we see it's large but often structured to avoid reporting requirements, whereas for proliferation financing, these may be more moderate amounts and the transactions appear legitimate with the transaction profile, which I'm afraid, as we know, makes it harder to detect. So I just wanted to point out a couple of those highlights. Of course, anyone who's in the Cayman Islands or even elsewhere can have a look at that section 14 of the guidance notes. But I think now, Kimberly, we have a poll for everyone.
We do, and Tom, if you don't mind launching that poll. So we're asking here if you can participate. Have you conducted a proliferation financing risk assessment for your organization? Or if you are a regulator or any kind of supervisory agency, have you done one for your industry or for your country? So please, if you can, take a moment to respond to that. So far, it's we've got regulators. Sorry, I didn't have a chance to see, any kind of supervisory agencies who's joining us today, but we have a few who have said yes. We'll give it just about 10 more seconds. And, okay, yep, we're a few more. Okay, great, fantastic. And do you mind showing that, sharing those poll results, Tom? So I am showing that 28% said yes, they have for their organization. 3% as regulators have said they have for their countries. 63% have said no, they have not. And so maybe today you'll have some information to help you do a proliferation risk assessment. And I'm assuming, are you covering how to perform a proliferation risk assessment in your slides, Elizabeth?
Yes, so we're going to look at the risk factors at the entity level. So that's really interesting, and I'm not surprised that most people have not yet done it, because as we know, in the Cayman Islands, this requirement is not yet in place, and it is the newest extension. As we'll see from the next slide, it's the newest extension by FATF to require this PF risk assessment, having previously required the money laundering and terrorist financing risk assessments. So it was in 2020 that recommendation 1 was amended to include that entities in a country should now be required to identify, assess, and take effective action to mitigate not only money laundering and terrorist financing, but also proliferation financing risks. So this was brought in by FATF in the recommendation in 2020, and then in 2021 they issued guidance, which is helpful guidance that I'd encourage everyone to review on conducting proliferation financing risk assessments and mitigation. So what FATF say there is identifying, assessing, and understanding proliferation financing risks on a regular basis is essential to strengthening either a country's or a private sector's, as the case may be, ability to prevent designated persons and entities involved in weapons of mass destruction proliferation from raising, storing, moving, and using funds and thus other financial assets. The implementation of targeted financial sanctions is essential for a stronger counter-proliferation financing regime. And so what FATF are really saying by bringing in this recommendation and the guidance is that simply screening the list is not sufficient, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. So this requirement came in as a recommendation in 2020. There is a draft methodology for the 5th round, and when FATF comes to assess countries for the 5th round, that's when it will be assessing whether or not this recommendation has been complied with.
Great. And when is that the 5th round reviews start? Is that 2024 or 25?
Yes, it's just around the corner now. So the FATF website has a schedule which it states is subject to change, but currently the first country in the hot seat is Belgium, with an on-site tentatively scheduled for April 2025, which means, of course, the review of documents, etc., will begin in 2024. So literally just around the corner.
All right, congratulations, Belgium, for being first, leading the way. Good luck. Okay.
So that's what FATF said. Now, the Cayman Islands has drafted amendments to its AML regulations. These draft regulations were circulated in January 2023 for the usual request for feedback and comments. That deadline was extended. The regulations aren't yet in force, but this is what they say. A person carrying out relevant financial business must take steps as appropriate to the nature and size of its business to identify, assess, and understand its proliferation financing risk. And then it gives us our 4 categories, which we are familiar with due to the other risk assessments that are required and have been conducted. So first, in relation to the customers of the entity. Second, the geographic area. Third, and this is the geographic area in which the customer resides or operates. Third, the product, services, and transactions. And fourth, the delivery channels. So entities must then assess their proliferation financing risk in relation to these 4 areas. And today I'm just going to discuss the first 3 of those in a bit more detail and give some suggestions on how this may be done. In relation to the delivery channels, I think people are familiar with that and these considerations about face-to-face or not, and they don't vary really between proliferation financing and the other risk assessments we're familiar with. But in relation to the other 3 categories, I want to talk about those in a little bit more detail, because one does really need to make sure there that these proliferation financing specific factors are taken into account. And another important point I should refer to in relation to these regulations and indeed the FATF standards is this risk means strictly and only the potential breach, non-implementation or evasion of targeted financial sanctions in relation to proliferation financing. And this is important because, and I think it was discussed in the earlier webinar that you did, obviously proliferation financing is a large issue, and when one is even assessing the proliferation financing risk in the perimeters that we'll look at that are required, one may still wish to take those other factors into account. But it's important to recognize that the area which is required is narrower, and I've laid that out on the next slide, where we see that there are 2 country-specific regimes, which is DPRK and Iran, and countries are required to freeze without delay the funds or other assets and ensure they're not made available directly or indirectly for the benefit of the person or entity designated, persons or entities acting on their behalf, or owned or controlled by them. And so this requirement about sanctions was already in force. And what was happening was entities were screening the list. And of course, if you fell under category A, if you were a person or entity designated by the UN, when that list was screened, your name would come up as a hit. However, what would not come up is persons and entities acting on behalf of the designated person or owned or controlled by them. So this is really the area now that when we look at the wider risk, the proliferation financing risk, and understand what that means and how it works, hopefully it will assist entities to identify not only the persons on the list, but those acting on their behalf or owned or controlled by them.
Yes, and I wanted to point out too, one of the things that I think you're talking about, Tozan Casanova's webinar, I think it was back in March or April when we talked about this. She was a nuclear policy expert, and she was kind of explaining that the people who are on those lists are the known proliferators. There's still a whole bunch of unknowns, and so that's the reason why the proliferation financing risk assessment, because you can't just rely on the list either.
Exactly, and we'll come on to a paper she had done after her webinar, which you kindly invited me to the the meeting on that, Kimberly, and that's a really helpful paper as well that I'll talk about, which identifies exactly that problem. So in order to get around this problem and go wider than the list, one very useful source of information, and it's specifically referred to in the CIMA guidance notes, is the UN Panel of Experts report. And in relation to DPRK, this is published twice a year, and it contains extremely helpful and useful information. And just again, to bring home the reality of the situation, this is the most recent report of March 2023, and it notes that in 2022, 73 ballistic missiles and combined missiles were launched, including 8 intercontinental ballistic missiles, and 42 of those took place in the last 4 months of the year. So this is really current. And the report also notes, and it's been noted previously by the panel of experts and in other literature, that sanctions evaders often set up shell or front companies to layer and mask their connections, which is again where all the measures such as identifying the risk, knowing what you're looking for, and getting to the bottom of the beneficial ownership structure are so critical. And I've just provided here an extract from that same March 2023 report, which shows a chart. And this is a chart showing the ownership and management of 2 ships that were acquired by DPRK. And when you look at the reports and the panel of experts reports that they do, as well as other literature, you'll often see charts such as these, which really demonstrate these complex structures and how important it is to get to the bottom of them and then to identify links. So for example, if you follow the ship Toyo Haru up to Sunny International and then up again to Mr. Feng, if you follow the dotted line to the left of the screen, you can see that he's the former director of SL International Shipping Co., owned by Mr. Gao, and then Mr. Gao links back again to those 2 ships. So it's only really when you start to analyze the structure and get to the bottom of it, you can see the links, and of course also identify other entities that might be owned by persons of concern. So I just provided that as an example, and of course there's more in those reports. And the other point that I wanted to refer to here, and this is from the report I was just referring to by Dr. Casanova that came out this year, and she talks about countering the challenges of proliferation financing. And she gives some examples in relation to Iran. So we hear a lot about DPRK, and I thought it was important to also provide some information about Iran, which is the second regime that falls under these requirements. And here, in relation to procurement, the paper identifies the use of false end user information, again, the use of front companies, and also the use of the same individuals acting as owners of several companies located in different countries. For example, the same person owns a company that puts in an order, and then the company that is used as an intermediary to receive the sensitive item. So again, it's looking at the charts, getting all the relevant information and trying to identify those connections. In relation to payment, the use of payments under $10,000 to avoid scrutiny, the use of money exchanges, and the use of correspondent accounts are identified in that paper in relation to risk areas for proliferation financing regarding Iran. And a case study is also provided. Well, there's a number of case studies, but the one I've referred to here of Shahab Gazri is interesting because this was a company based in Sweden where one may not expect to see this kind of activity. And I think it's really important to keep a broad and open mind and not be confined to what one may imagine is the country of interest, but to really conduct a thorough risk assessment and be aware to what the risk factors are, because it could have in fact affect any country. So in this case, the company was used to procure sensitive goods from European suppliers for the benefit of Iran. The money was received from Iran via a money exchange company in Sweden, and there was the use of wire transfers to a Swedish bank. The Swedish banks reported the suspicious activity, and the individual at one point indicated UAE as an end-use destination, but then at the last minute changed that to Iran, which of course was a red flag. The Swedish authorities intercepted that particular shipment, and when they searched his home, they found documents related to previous transactions. Now, this took place 2011, 2012. In 2013, the Swedish court found him guilty, and I thought it was interesting that he was just given a 3-month suspended jail sentence, so who knows if that would be greater now. But that was an example from Iran that I wanted to give you, just to say that there are examples from Iran as well as DPRK. So
that's an interesting case too, because that would have taken the bank and customs, as well as the FIU in the different countries all working together.
Yes, and I think that's a really important point when one looks at country level risk assessments, and that was a requirement that was in place before this 2020 amendment, which was how are your relevant authorities cooperating and coordinating with each other in relation to proliferation financing. And that was something that some countries struggled with, because of course you may have different agencies to those which are speaking to each other for money laundering. So you've just identified customs, you may want to involve your shipping registry. So it's really important that all the different agencies are aware of the issue, aware of the risks, and coordinating and cooperating with each other.
Okay.
So we had a look at these two regimes and some case studies and ideas of what they're doing. And now another point that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention from the FATF guidance is that the absence of cases involving known or suspected breaches or non-implementation or evasion does not necessarily mean that there's a low risk. So we can't say because we haven't seen it, our risk is low. And this is because designated persons and entities have made use of diverse and constantly evolving methods to disguise those illicit activities and their networks. So they're exploring ways to evade the targeted financial sanctions, and this is regardless of the proximity to DPRK and Iran. So, for example, transactions may go through countries with weak controls in order that they won't be identified. So one of the suggestions here is that private sector firms may make use of techniques such as scenario building, and we're seeing that more often. And that could either be taking a scenario from another similar jurisdiction that could happen in your jurisdiction and assessing it, or it could be a hypothetical scenario based on what could actually happen given the known risks. So just because you don't have cases, first of all, doesn't mean there's no risk, and second of all, it doesn't prevent you from using scenarios or typologies to assess your risk and controls. And this is exactly what the Cayman Islands did. They conducted their national risk assessment in 2021, and there is a section on proliferation financing. And they noted that as at the end of 2020, there were no identified cases involving the Cayman Islands, no SARs had been filed in relation to proliferation financing, no assets had been frozen, no known investigations or international requests. However, and following the FATF guidance, the report noted that whilst there may be no direct PF links, the exposure to the international financial market poses risks of sanctions being evaded. And it noted that the most likely exposure is from its cross-border business, financial transactions and activities, and the significant corporate sector which conducts business around the world without necessarily having strong ties with the local financial sector. So it was noted that while there was no data or evidence to suggest proliferation financing has taken place, it was the exposure of the financial system to the international financial market that posed the PF risk and the potential threat of a breach or sanctions evasion, and the risk was rated as medium high. So on the next slide, I've shown you directly from that NRA and the section on proliferation financing, how that overall score of medium high was obtained. And the report breaks down those various sectors. As we said before, you see some sectors here that we don't normally see because it's proliferation financing specific, such as the shipping registry, the aircraft registry. And you will see in the report a write-up of each of these sections and then the determining risk rating given, which amounted to an overall risk of medium high. So that was what was done at the country level. Countries are now required, as well as entities, to conduct these proliferation financing risk assessments. But today we're looking at the entity level. At the entity level, the entities will, of course, in the same way they do for money laundering, refer back to what's known at the national level, which will help them when they are conducting their entity level risk assessment. And then we saw that specifically there's 4 categories that need to be considered: the customer, the geography, products and services, and delivery channels. So starting with customers, there is this interesting report by RUSI. As I said, they have a lot of interesting papers and work on proliferation financing. This chart comes from their Institutional Proliferation Finance Risk Assessment Guide of this year. And they go through these different categories and they provide both risk factors and potential acts of proliferation finance. So this is a useful and a helpful document, whatever jurisdiction you're in, whether you're in the Cayman Islands or not. And the only point I would note here, as I said earlier, of course, proliferation financing risk is broader than those 2 regimes that we've talked about. And a lot of this work relates to those broader risks, which of course is helpful, and entities may find it useful to take this into account. But just to note, as we said before, the requirement here relates to those 2 specific regimes. So they set out here those risk factors for customers and also the risk factors for the business activity, occupation, or industry of the customer, which I've set out on the next slide. And they note here, for example, money service businesses. We just saw that in the case example we looked at, maritime or shipping industry, embassies and consulates. So you can see there some of the risk factors to be aware of. And CIMA's guidance notes, even though they predated this requirement, as I said, also have helpful information as it relates to customers. And those guidance notes state that financial service providers should determine the exposure of their clients to the manufacture, trade, or provision of expertise or consulting services relating to sensitive or dual-use goods. That also, taking a risk-based approach, financial service providers should identify the clients that pose a smaller risk and concentrate on gathering more information from the customers that remain. And of course, this is a resource-intensive exercise, so the focus should be on those remaining customers. And FSPs and DNFBPs should also be aware of the transactions of their clients, particularly paying attention to payments being made to importers, exporters, shipping agents, brokers, and freight forwarders, especially where controlled and dual-use goods are being shipped to conduit countries, which are those countries near sanctioned customers, sanctioned countries. And the guidance notes also provide some helpful red flags in relation to customers. So those involved in the supply or sale of dual use goods, where the customer activity does not match the business profile or end user information does not match the end user profile. A customer engages in a transaction that lacks business sense or strategy, or that is inconsistent with historical patterns of trade activity. So while a lot of these are common features that we see in other risk assessments, which is of course knowing your customer, knowing their business activity, and knowing when it's out of line, there are also some additional elements here, such as looking at that pattern of trade activity. And of course, the same concept that we've looked at in relation to other risk assessments, where the customer is vague or inconsistent in the information it provides. So that was customers and some of the risk factors you might see there. Now, moving on to geography. So when entities are looking at their risk in terms of geography, they're going to look both at the sanctioned country as well as countries that are known to have ties with that sanctioned country. And the guidance notes helpfully list China, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia. Also, entities should identify clients with payments to importers or exporters, shipping agents, brokers that export to countries and ports near the border of sanctioned countries. And again, there is helpful information that shipments of prohibited goods to DPRK may be marked as destined to Dandong in China and other nearby ports. So I think the more concrete examples like that that entities have, the easier it's going to be for them to conduct these risk assessments. And it's really important to make sure that those most recent panel of expert reports are consulted, because of course they are going to contain that up-to-date and current information. And there's also there a note in the CIMA guidance notes in relation to Iran, and where you may see goods being labelled as being shipped to in relation to bordering countries of Iran that may in fact be destined for Iran. CIMA guidance notes also list some red flags. So of course you have transactions involving a country of diversion concern, or countries that are known to trade with North Korea, and there's a list there. Transaction involves shipment of goods inconsistent with normal geographical trade patterns, or, and we saw this earlier, the transaction involves financial institutions with known deficiencies in AML controls or located in weak export control and enforcement jurisdictions. So in a minute, we're going to come on to how one may identify such countries. But I just note here that CIMA guidance notes note this, FATF has noted this, other literature notes this, that not only should entities be aware of the sanctioned countries themselves and countries close to them which may be used as ports, but also countries should be aware of the misuse of countries with weak controls.
I just wanted to point out too, so those FATF recommendations and the updates, that was all 2020, 2021. And the world has changed since then. So one of the questions that we do have right now is, what about Russia? So I don't want to kind of go into that, but it's like, these are everything, all those countries that you mentioned, no, none of them mentioned Russia. And I'm guessing it's because, again, our guidance and our recommendations just haven't, caught up with world events that are happening so quickly right now.
Yeah.
So don't just limit yourself to these countries as being potential risk factors. This is why this is kind of so important for us right now.
I completely agree. I think that's an excellent question. And that goes back to the point I was making about making sure you keep up to date. And of course, even the most recent panel of experts report is March 23. And we're seeing at the moment the meeting potentially with Putin, and of course entities need to watch these developments and consider from their own perspective what are my risk factors? So these documents can provide suggestions and guidance, but of course the entity must consider what relevant factors they're taking into account. And an entity won't be penalized for being more current, more aware, and having a better assessment of their risk than was previously alluded to in the documents. So whilst the documents may help and provide some guidance, they certainly can't be a be-all and end-all. Just to note that, just so we're clear, the FATF requirements don't relate to Russia. So therefore, we're still only talking about these two regimes. But of course, when we're talking about countries that may be of interest or assisting these regimes, I think that's what the question related to. If I'm correct, then yes, we will need to keep abreast of Russia and its interactions with North Korea. But in terms of the sanctions regime itself, while we have sanctions on Russia, these proliferation financing sanctions only apply to these two regimes. So I'll just finish off this geography point here by noting again that same table I referred to in the RUSI document also lists geographic risks. And again, it also notes those countries that have a weak level of compliance with international requirements, as does the FATF guidance. So as we've seen this come up through these different documents that one needs to be aware of these countries, I thought it would be interesting to look at the FATF assessments. So there's two relevant FATF requirements. One is recommendation 7, which looks at how well countries are implementing their targeted financial sanctions in relation to proliferation financing. And as you can see here, there's compliant is on our left, and it's fairly small. Largely compliant is the third to the right. And then we have a lot of partially compliant and non-compliant countries. And non-compliant countries include, for example, St. Lucia, Venezuela. The up-to-date list is on the FATF website. And this is also the case for immediate outcome 11, which is on the next slide. So recommendation 7, do you have your systems in place? Because if you don't, evasion is not going to be detected. Immediate outcome 11, how well are you implementing those measures? How well is your country doing at preventing and detecting the evasion of proliferation financing sanctions? So you can see here again, there's a tiny, I think 2 have reached the highest grade of highly effective. And we do have more substantials here. And then we have our low levels of effectiveness and moderate. So in low, we see countries such as Iceland, Latvia, Saudi Arabia, Barbados, and Aruba. So I mention this because entities can go to the FATF website. You can see what the results were for these types of recommendations, and this may be a factor that you want to consider when you're thinking about that geographical risk and whether countries are countries that may be of concern. So we've looked at customers, we've looked at geography. The final category that I wanted to look at was products and services. Again, I've listed here that helpful table from the RUSI document. And as you said earlier, Kimberly, anyone who would like a copy of the slides is very welcome to contact you, and I know you will provide them. So I won't go through all of this now. But I do think that's a really helpful table that entities may be interested in when they're considering these risk factors and what they may be looking at. And again, CIMA's guidance notes also detail products and services. They note here shipping insurance and insurance. So this is an interesting category because we often see that insurance is lower risk for money laundering. And of course, in relation to proliferation financing, this shipping insurance is crucial. And that's an area that needs to be looked at when considering proliferation financing risk. SEMA guidance notes also note the use of trade finance. So therefore, you can look at any products and services that you offer relating to trade finance, and also whether any loans or credit is provided to clients in sensitive industries or higher risk jurisdictions. So that was a whirlwind tour of 3 of the 4 risk assessment factors that are outlined as being required to be considered in relation to proliferation financing risk. Of course, it doesn't end there. These risk assessments must be documented and kept up to date. There must be a mechanism for providing them to the regulators. Importantly then, those risks that have been identified need to be managed and mitigated. So this is going to be done by policies, controls, and procedures, and they, of course, need to be monitored. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what those controls and mitigating measures may look like. And I'd mentioned earlier the paper of Dr. Casanova, who spoke on your webinar, Kimberly, and she identifies more problems, but I've listed 2 of them here from her paper. And I should note as well that at the end of these slides, I list all these papers if people want to go and look at the source documents. So in her paper of, I think, July this year, Countering the Challenges of Proliferation Financing, Common Problems with Implementing Proliferation Financing Controls, 2 of the areas identified are reliance on list screening. This is on the next slide. What she says is the screening against these lists is the main tool used by financial institutions. So I think, sorry, Kimberly, I think I missed the poll there. I think it'd be interesting to do the poll before we talk about this further to see what people are doing.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do the poll. Yeah.
So the question is, do you screen only against TFS lists, or do you screen and conduct additional checks, or do you do neither the TFS checks nor the additional checks?
Right. And I was kind of having some questions as well. I'll just see if I can kind of go back in my brain to find out about the controls and the products and services that she was talking about. Yeah, maybe you answered it. Sorry, I've my brain just went blank on me as far as what question I did have.
I know that feeling, Kimberly.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, we were kind of talking about it earlier. It's like there's just so much going on that, and then you have something like this, which is a very real threat. And I guess maybe one of my questions for you at the end, while people are answering the poll, is this almost seems like a whole separate skill set, proliferation financing risk assessment. Do you see the industry needing more people who are specialized in this skill?
Yes, I don't know how far you need to be specialized, but you certainly need to have people who are aware of these different risk factors. We'll see in a moment the identified need for training. Have you got people who've been trained on these risks? Are the people who are in the positions where they need to recognize the risk, are they trained? Because if it's just your compliance officer, how's it going to get to the compliance officer? And then, of course, do you have people who are trained in assessing the entity-wide, the entity-level risk in relation to proliferation financing? So definitely you need that training for your staff members in order to be compliant.
Okay. All right, Tom, if you don't mind going ahead and sharing the results of the poll. So I'm showing 23% screen against TFS list only. That's the terrorist financing list. The sanctions list only, which of course is, as we've already mentioned, a bit, it's going to miss a lot. So it is good to see 59% do screen against the TFS list and conduct additional checks, and 18% or not. So hopefully the 18% will start screening. And yes, fantastic. So good to know. Thank
Yeah.
you, Tom. You can hide that now. All right.
So 59% is an excellent number.
Yes.
The screening against the TFS list is, of course, already in force, has been in force, and is mandatory. So that's the sort of very lowest level. But of course, reliance on the list screening alone is not enough. And this is what was identified in the paper I was referring to. So it was noted that this is the main tool that's used. And of course, it is necessary and it must be done, but it's not an effective tool for implementing sound proliferation financing controls if it's employed on its own. One reason, this generates a high number of false positives, and then clearing these and sorting them all out takes time away from conducting other risk management measures. But the more serious problem, and the one that we referred to earlier, is that designated entities and individuals hide behind associates' names and front or shell companies. And therefore, when you scan that list, that name won't pop up because it's not the person themselves. So that's why this can't be used on its own. Now, we should note here that those targeted financial sanctions regulations and the mandate to comply with them pre-existed. And it seems that the area that was being missed was those front companies acting on the direction, or it may be an individual acting on behalf of the designated person. So it's hoped that by conducting these risk assessments and being aware of the risk factors, that there won't only be a reliance on the list, but that we'll be more able to identify those acting on behalf of the designated person. And the other problem identified in the paper, and there are more than these two that I've picked out, is the customer due diligence and transaction monitoring not accounting for proliferation financing. So while you may have certain risk factors that jump out to you that are picked up on in relation to other risks, if they're not specific to proliferation financing, then of course they won't be caught. So hopefully, again, conducting these risk assessments will help to solve that problem. So FATF gives some ideas of what can be done to mitigate these improved onboarding processes and enhance customer due diligence, controls to ensure the effectiveness of your procedures for sanctions screening. You can leverage the program you already have and utilize that to identify potential sanctions evasion. As we were just discussing, training for your staff on PF risks, PF typologies, and mitigation that can be used, and investment in technology and advanced software where this is proportionate to the risk that you face. So this, just to talk about the CIMA guidance notes to finish off on this controls issue. The CIMA guidance notes, as I mentioned, refer specifically to the UN panel of experts because this contains those names of entities and individuals involved in these activities and other very important information. So that's a really useful source when you're expanding beyond the list itself. The KYD and CDD framework should include factors relevant to proliferation financing. So when you're looking at the nature of business and the clients and jurisdictions, that you're also taking these factors into account, as well as clients who are sellers or manufacturers of these sensitive goods, their trade patterns, and ensuring that your ongoing monitoring is also taking this into account. And the CIMA guidance notes specifically also refer to training. So that is really important, Kimberly, as you just mentioned.
Yeah.
So before we go on, yes.
KYD, is that a typo, or should
That's
that
a typo.
be KYC?
KYC. KYD
Okay.
is our currency. KYC payment dollars, and KYC, know your customer, should be there as well as customer due diligence.
All right. I was thinking, I thought I knew every acronym in AML, but I've obviously missed one. Okay, so that should be KYC. All right, thank you.
Okay, So we've sort of had a very whirlwind tour of these factors to be taken into account, what we can then do to mitigate. And so our final poll is, are targeted financial sanctions compliance risk-based?
All right, so go ahead and do you mind expanding about that? Are you talking about the lists, the targeted financial sanctions lists? Are they risk-based?
Yes, so the
Okay.
list, in fact, as we just saw, the list does include in the mandate in relation to sanctions evasion and sanctions compliant, it includes both the list and those acting on our behalf. It just so happens that most people are only using the list. But when I say targeted financial sanctions compliant, I mean ensuring that those on the list and those behind those on the list are being caught.
Mm-hmm. And it's funny because you know, I've been in compliance for a while, and whenever I saw this question, I was like, I'm not quite sure I would know how to answer that, because I see sanctions lists. They are, you know, it's they are. There's some politics going on. They're trying to, you know, especially with like the Russian sanctions. You know, it's my opinion that a lot of the people who are on it, they're trying to, you know, get them to pressure, leaders of other countries to, in their mind, do the right thing. So when it comes to, are these lists risk based? I'm not sure how I'd answer. I would probably be
Sorry.
going in the I don't know. I'm not sure
Not,
unless I'm understanding the question
yes,
wrong.
not are the composition of the list risk-based. Is compliance with the list risk-based?
Oh, okay, okay. I think that helps. So I'll give everybody a chance. All right, we have some answers in. And if you want to share the results, I am showing 48% are saying yes, 27% no, and 25% they're in my category, don't know, unsure. So
Okay,
what's your answer to that?
okay. So that brings me nicely onto my last slide, Kimberly, and it's a point I really want to emphasize. So in relation to freezing and reporting and ensuring that no funds are made available to sanctioned individuals or those acting on their behalf. This is not risk-based, this is rules-based. You must comply. So you have to screen your list. You are supposed to identify those acting on behalf of those on the list, and you must not allow funds to move. That is not a risk-based approach. That is something you must do, and that has always been in place. The change now is the requirement to conduct a risk assessment, and it's by conducting this risk assessment that you may be able to identify more trends, further risks, and areas that require further scrutiny. So I think it's really important because it is an area, as you say, which has caused confusion. And it's really important to note that screening for sanctions is mandatory and it's something that has to be done, whereas the risk assessment is the new requirement for regulated entities. So I just wanted to clarify that because, of course, when we're talking about risk assessments and we often talk about risk-based, I think it's really important to just stress that the actual lists themselves are mandatory. We don't take a risk-based approach to whether or not someone's on the list.
Okay, and is that in Cayman? Is it your experience? Because you mentioned the Cayman Reg or Act for Proliferation Financing Prohibition Act. Is it the same in other countries as well, like UK and European countries, or do they have a
Yes.
prescribed requirement? Okay, okay.
Yes,
All right.
yes. So the requirement to comply with the sanctions has always been there. The new part is conducting this risk assessment.
For the proliferation financing risk.
Risk, yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, we've got about a minute to go. Here are the list of documents, and yes, to those who are asking, you can request the slides. I'll go ahead and give you his name. Scott is Scott at silocompliance.com. There will be an email going out, so you'll get his email. So you can request the slides. Again, I can't send them via mass email. They're too big. Somebody was asking for SEMA, a copy of the SEMA guidance notes. You can go to, is it SEMA.ky? Is their
Yes,
website,
yes.
I believe.
They're on,
Yeah.
yeah, they're on the SEMA
And
website.
Yeah, and I have to admit, I think the guidance notes are very well written. You can read them, you understand them. Um, somebody, yeah, was just asking for, are you able to zip? Yeah, no, I've tried that. It just won't work in our email system. Now we can send it by a regular, just one-off email, Alana. So we will send you those. If you do want to request the slides, you can. All right, and how can you assist people who are struggling? I know you in Cayman, you said being in Cayman, you are doing a one-day ACAMS workshop. That's 7th of October, correct?
Yes, we've partnered with ACAM. So anyone who wants to become ACAM certified, please do send me an email, and we're conducting a one-day training on the 7th of October, and we still have spaces if anybody would like to join us. It's in person, it's one day, and hopefully it will help you prepare for your certification so you can become CAMS certified.
Yes, and so we have a staff member here who just took her ACAMS exam. It is tough. She walked out of that exam like 3 hours later, looking exhausted, and she said it was the toughest exam she's ever taken. So it is not an easy certification program. I do recommend getting some help if you're struggling, or if you are trying to get that uh, that certification. It's a great, uh, I think, standard to meet. So yeah, please do reach out. And any other, like I said, you can also do some regulatory advice. You can help government agencies. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, we often
Okay.
work with government agencies, regulators, preparing for or remediating after mutual evaluations, and also
Okay.
at the entity level, assisting with these risk assessments, AML officer appointments, or preparation for or remediation after inspections, and of course the
Yeah.
training and AML audits.
Okay, fantastic. So here's Elizabeth's email, and of course their website as well. Claritas Legal. Do you have a Claritas Compliance website, or does that just
It
lead
takes,
everybody to takes
yeah,
you to
leads you
Claritas
to the
Legal?
same
Okay.
one. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so we are at the top of the hour. Thank you, Elizabeth, so much. Again, I really appreciate, and I know others do too, appreciate the time that you give us. And because you do a lot of work preparing for this. This is not just 1 hour free time. This is hours of preparing. So I really do, I think, appreciate your time and your effort in these broadcast for us. And, again, just I can't say thank you enough. And I know others have also sent their thanks as well. So
Thank
again, so we're
you for
going to
having me.
yeah, so we're going to close up. I know everybody's busy and has to get back to work or lunch. So certificates will be auto generated. You should get that in about an hour. Please check your inbox. Please do also participate in the survey email that will be sent out. This is going to help me identify some topics for the future, because we're planning our 2024 calendar. I'm also trying to get an appetite for AI technology, so please do respond to that survey. Our next webinar is in October. I don't know the exact date. Tom, do you have the exact date and topic by any
It's the
chance?
18th of October, and it's the travel rule in regards to virtual assets.
Great, yeah, and that was Andy. He gave a virtual assets talk a couple of months ago, and he could only mention the travel rule briefly. He said that's a whole nother hour, so he has agreed to come back. So we're very appreciative of him coming as well. I'm going to be in two conferences that are coming up, CRCA in Cayman. So anybody who's in Cayman, please stop by our booth. You'll meet Tom too in person. And also I will be at the AMLP Financial Crimes Conference in London. That's in mid-November. I'm actually going to be on one of the panels on stage speaking on the first day. So please do, and we'll have somebody manning a booth as well. So please do stop by if you're either in London or Cayman. And I'm also inviting everybody, if you are struggling with systems, or if you want to kind of look at some systems, we are doing an open demo tomorrow of Silo Compliance System, and that's going to be at 9 a.m. Eastern. So please do, again, I'll be sending an invite to everybody, and you are welcome to join us, just drop in. And yes, so somebody else was wondering, Elizabeth, your email, ELI, sorry, I'm going to show that because somebody was asking for that real quick. So yeah, so please do, Samantha, if you can take a note of her email there. And I'm getting a lot of thanks. So once again, thank you so much. Again, recording will go out in a couple of days. Expect your certificates. If you have any problems downloading your certificates, you try and use the Chrome browser. And again, if you have any other problems, Scott can help you. And that his email will be in our follow-up email that you should get in about 1 hour. And I hope to see everybody again in October, if not tomorrow. And thank you, Elizabeth. Hopefully I'll see you when I'm in Cayman.
Yes, thanks so much. I'll be at the conference as well, so I'll see you there, Kimberly.
Okay, fantastic, fantastic. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Anti-money laundering compliance and customer and vendor onboarding involves multiple processes that must be done correctly and by the right people in the most efficient way. The tasks include gathering customer and vendor ID and verification documents, screening against sanctions and politically exposed persons lists, analyzing any reputational risk, periodic monitoring to assess any changes and updating due diligence, and staff training on money laundering, terrorist financing, bribery and corruption awareness and risks, as well as keeping them up to date on your policies and procedures and new regulatory requirements. In addition to the onboarding processes being strictly followed and documented, management must have access to critical compliance metrics and information to steer the company through regulatory waters and mitigate customer and other risks. With Silo Compliance System, these obligations become much more efficient. With Silo, your staff can enter the customer's information and upload due diligence documents and any other documents that you require. Key information entered about your customer automatically calculates a risk score, a calculation using a risk-based approach determined by you at initial implementation of Silo. In addition, if you have screening enabled, when the customer's name is first entered into Silo, the name is checked against sanctions, politically exposed persons lists, and adverse media. You'll see results of screening immediately and can review any potential hits right away. And with screening enabled, your customers and vendors are continuously monitored for any sanctions advisories, helping you get ahead of any potential reputational risks. No company is too small to benefit from using Silo. Even if your onboarding processes seem under control today, if one key staff member becomes unavailable or there is any increase in your customer portfolio, compliance with strict onboarding and review processes can quickly overwhelm a small company and put you at risk. Plus, implementing Silo can reduce the need to hire additional staff to manage compliance obligations and reduce your risk of non-compliance regulatory penalties and continued inspections. No one goes through an inspection or audit with great ease, but several users have reported that their inspections went more smoothly and with Silo they had improved outcomes. Reach out to us today to schedule a demo of Silo.